Alright guys, so today we'll be discussing about the medical genetics disorders. So in this lecture, what we're going to do is that we're going to actually build the foundations of the different genetic disorders. And the reason why we're doing that is because, genetics can be challenging for a lot of people. So let's actually build the foundations talking about different classifications of disorders, and we'll talk about the different terminology that you should be very clear. Then after that, we'll talk each one of those disorder, all right? But let's build our big foundations, okay? That's what we're gonna do in this video. Now, whenever we talk about genetics, again, basic first, right? This word genetics, whenever we hear about genetics, right? This word, where does that come from? It basically came from this word called genetikos, and that is a Greek word for generative, okay? Now, after that, remember genetics by define, we basically define as what? It's a study, it's a branch of biology which studies what genes, genetic variations, and hereditary, okay? Now, after these definitions, let's talk about what are these medical genetic disorders. And if you wanna, classify these genetic disorders, let's classify them in three categories, all right? Now, this is very important. Remember, we're starting from the genetic disorders, all right? So we'll just make it a diagram like this. Right? So now, number one disorders, right? Which is more commonly associated with this. This number one disorder, it's going to be a, let's just say, multi. This is a multifactorial, right? This is a multifactorial inheritance, or let's just say multifactorial genetic. Let's just say this is a genetic disorders. Let's write down this word. Right, this is the one, and we'll talk each one of them. Now another one, okay, we'll just write down, this is number one right here, okay? Now, second type of disorders we'll talk about is, this is going to be, we'll talk about, this is, let's just say, single or mono gene, single gene genetic disorder. So we'll just write down single gene genetic, right? Single gene genetic disorders. We'll just write down, we'll make it easy. It's a single gene genetic disorders. And third, which one is basically a disorder that has to do with the cytogenic, right? Genic disorders. And we'll talk about this. So if we categorize in these three classifications, it's gonna make our life a lot easier. Now, whenever we're talking about multifactorial, there's a couple of concepts you have to remember is this, that, whenever we're talking about multifactorial, this multifactorial, right? Whenever we're talking about, which means that involves two things here, all right? This means that there is involvement of the genes, all right? All right? Plus, also it involves environmental factors, all right? And that basically, both genes plus environmental factor, environments that basically produce this multifactorial genetic disorders, right? Now, that means that, what are some of the disease that comes in this multifactorial genetic disorders, right? For this one, let's classify this into, again, two categories, all right? We'll just say this one is, maybe one is, let's just say, you have a congenital, right? This is a congenital disorders, which comes in multifactorial, and other one is, maybe let's just say this comes in, let's just say, childhood, right? Childhood, or you have adult onset of disorders. Now, this is what we're going to classify. Now, what are those disorders that comes in genetics, right? The multifactorial disorders. Look, for that one, let's write down in red. Okay, number one, remember this is congenital, right? Now, number one that you should remember is this, in congenital, okay? Now, actually, let me write down in a little bit better, so you should remember this very well. Look, the one is that, you probably have heard something called neural tube defects, right? This could be one. Or maybe other one is like for example, holoprosen, right? Prosencephaly, where you basically have what? Like a cleft palate, right? The cleft, basically lips and all of that, right? So you have a holoprosencephaly. Third, not only neural T where a whole person encephaly is there, maybe like congenital, let's just say you talk about congenital heart diseases. That could be one, right? No. Or maybe other, like for example, pyloric stenosis, this could be one. Look, these are different types of disorder that comes in what? Congenital, gene, environmental, plus the multi-factor disorders, right? But remember, these are congenitals. But we also have to talk about some of the disorder that comes in this headings, which is childhood or adult onset disorders. And this is where we'll talk about it. Okay, let me write down a different color here, so you know this. So this is a child, and here this is what we're talking about. Like if you're talking about child, you're talking about, what is this? Asthma, or maybe not only this. Like for example, most commonly you see something called diabetes mellitus, right? Not only this, like for example, hypertension, like that, or maybe let's just say a condition like glaucoma, right? Or maybe let's just say 5. These are basically common: asthma, diabetes mellitus, hypertension, glaucoma, like epilepsy, right? This could be one. Or maybe like some kind of like abnormalities with your brain, like for example, mania, depressions, right? That one. Or maybe like 7, which could be is schizophrenia, right? So conditions like this, right? These ones are basically congenital or adult onset disorders, right? Which has a both like genes plus it plus environmental factor also contributes giving this type of disorders, right? And which is basically come in a multi-factor or multi-inheritance genetic disorders. This is an important disorders, right? Now, and oftentimes they're going to be we in a different organ system, we talk about all of this, and there are a lot of questions formed based on this. All right, it is very important. Now, after this, we also have to talk about the another classification that comes in the heading of single genetic disorders, right? Now, in here, when it comes to a single genetic disorders, right, you have to remember this, that usually this single genetic disorders, again, we classify them into 2 broad categories again, here too, right? And one is, all right, we'll just write down here. One classification, we just say this, that there is we'll write down here. One is that there is basically Mendelian classifications, all right? These are called Mendelian, right? Let's just say these are Mendelian classifications, all right? Or other one is basically non-classical genetic disorders, right? Non-classical single genetic disorders. Now, or we can simply say this is a Mendelian or classical, or let's just write down this is we'll just simply write down this is a classical genetic disorders. Now, remember this classical genetic disorder, this is what described by Mendelian. So you should remember this. So this one is a Mendel. This guy is a person who actually described this law. It's a Mendelian classical of genetic disorders, and this is a non-Mendelian classical of genetic disorders, all right? And when we're talking about this classical genetic disorder, single gene disorder, this usually, described obviously Mendelian by something called this. Either gene can be mutated and show something called autosomal. It could be like autosomal, right? Autosomal, or it could be, let's just say, sex-linked. All right, this could be sex-linked disorder. All right, now we'll talk about autosomal means, but this autosomal could be in 2 forms. Like it could be, let's say, it could be dominant, right? It could be dominant, or it could be recessive. It could be recessive like this. Same with the sex-linked disorder. It could be dominant with the D, or it could be recessive, right? So that's why whenever we're talking about single gene genetic disorders, that follows or that is explained by Mendelian law, right? Then we have to talk about this disease. Like for example, right here, if we combine all together, we'll have autosomal dominant, number 1. Number 2, you have a autosomal recessive autosomal, right? You have a 3, either sex-linked. You have a sex-linked. It could be X or Y. So you have X-linked dominant, or you have a X-linked recessive without, or maybe the Y linked to, same. But most commonly, this 4, you must remember for your step 1. Autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, and X-linked recessive. Very, very important, right? And those follows by classical genetic disorders. Now, after that, we also have a disorder that fits in, that is not actually described by Mendelian classifications, but by other, which is a non-classical genetic disorders, right? And here, this disorders, right? You have to remember this disorders really well. Remember, you have to remember all this. Especially, I want you to remember, like, especially single gene disorders or monogenetic disorders and cytogenic disorders, all the disorders, please remember this, right? And you guys kind of know this. We'll talk this in a different systems. Now, when it comes to non-classical genetic disorders, right? One is very important. Remember, we're missing mitochondrial here. So this comes here, mitochondrial, let's just say mitochondrial mutations, right? Mitochondrial genetic disorders, or mitochondrial inheritance. This comes right here. All right. Now, second one, you also have to remember this one, that there's something called genomic imprinting. This is also another disorder, which you have to remember all these disorders, and we'll talk each one of them. But right now, we're just listing all the disease because we're trying to build the foundations, your basic. Third, right? You also have something called trinucleotide expansion, that disease. And also the fourth one, this is called gonadal, right? Mosaicism, the gonadal mosaicisms, right? So these are the most important ones that you have to remember, right? So whenever we talk about single gene disorders, you have to remember this, that you have to classify them in either the genetic disorders or they are genetic disorder that has to do with classical genetic disorders that is actually described by Mendelian laws, right? And in there, you talk about autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, and X-linked recessive. There's 4 ones. But if they're non-classical, but they're single genetic disorders, then you have to remember mitochondrial inheritance, very important. Genomic imprinting, you must remember trinucleotide expansion. You must remember gonadal, mosaicisms, you must remember. These are very, very important, right? And usually, whenever we talk about the single genetic mutations, right, usually the cause is this, that usually the cause for this one is, it's basically a point mutation. Could be you have a missense mutations, right? It could be missense mutations. It could be, let's just say that nonsense mutation is there. Or it could be like a deletions is there, right? Or it could be insertion is there, or maybe it could be like a frame shift. It could be frame, because this causes frame shift mutations, right? Frame shift mutation. But remember, frame shift mutation is not multiplied by 3. We'll talk more about what that means too. But anyways, usually it's caused a single gene mutation, like missense, nonsense, deletions, or insertion. But there's mutations that are single gene, right? That's what it means. And usually, majority of the single gene mutations are caused by any one of this: missense, nonsense, deletions, insertions. Okay, these are the major cause of the single gene mutations. Now, after this, now let's talk about what are the disorders that comes in. Let's just say cytogenic, the cytogenic disorders, right? Remember, whenever we talk about cytogenic or cell genetics, referring as a genes you are talking about, right? The cytogenetics, right? There's basically a study of cells, right? And usually this cytogenetics, right? Whenever we talk about cytogenetic study, one more thing you have to remember is that we're basically studying the chromosomes, actually, right? So here we're talking about whenever you think about cytogenic, think about chromosomes, right? So we're studying about the chromosomes, right? And usually you microscopically, okay, remember the word microscopically, you actually observe the chromosomes, all right, which are usually condensed in a metaphase, right? And that's why you microscopically you observe those chromosomes, right? And you read them. You put them in a diagram, and that phenomena where, right, you microscopically look at the condensed chromosome, which are usually in a metaphase. Remember the word metaphase, right? and you basically make out the diagram of it, right? And that diagram, we call them a karyotype, all right? So that word is called karyotype. Please remember this word right? Karyotype. And I just described what that means. Now, anyways, this cytogenetic means that we're talking about the chromosome like this, right? We're talking about the chromosome. So here, we'll just simply say that we're studying diseases that has to do with the, all right, on black this time. We're talking about the chromosomal, right? Chromosomal alterations, or we can simply say abnormalities. This is what we're talking about. Right? Disorder that has to do with the chromosomes, right? Chromosomal alterations or abnormality. And here in the chromosomal abnormalities, right? You have to remember that chromosomal abnormalities, it can be classified into like basically, disease that can actually give a, okay, we'll just erase this part right here. It can give a disease that has to be a numerical, right? Numerical chromosomal abnormalities or structural, right? Structural, TRUAL, structural chromosomal abnormalities, all right? Numerical and structural. Now, before we talk about, what do we talk about numerical versus structural? We have to quickly talk about some concept here, which means that, look, we have normally how many chromosomes are present, right? So if you look at this, like the cell, right? You have a nucleus, right? Nucleus, and you have basically chromosomes like this, right? And within the chromosomes, you have, what is this called? You have basically a DNA like that, right? So this type of chromosome, how many chromosomes you have present in our body normally, right? Usually, if you're talking about germline, right? You get one from father, you get one from mother, okay? So usually in germline, you're talking about, we usually write this, let me write it down somewhere so you remember. Okay, let's just put it down here. Usually, write down here. Usually you're talking about this one. Let's just say this is coming from mother. And we'll just make this as, let's just say this is coming from father, right? Like this. So usually, you get, just like here, this is a father, mother, right? So you get one from father, you get one from mother, right? So you'll have one mother and one father, right? That's what you have. So usually, if you're talking about the number of chromosomes that are present are usually right like by something like 1n, right? 1 referring as a number of chromosomes, right? And basically, in a germline, right? 1, and this n is a random number of chromosomes, right? Which means that if we get in our germline, we basically get a 1 multiplied by 23. What is this? That gives you 23 chromosomes from a mother, and then you get another, let's just say, another 1n, which will be 1 right here, and then 23, right? And that is another one, 23, right? And this is from father. So together, when you add together, what happens? We multiply 2, right? We multiply 2, let's just say, this is from, let's say this is mother, right? This is father. And then if you do this, or sometimes we can just write down 2n, right? Because one is father, one is mother, that equals to 2, right? And you do 2 times 23, what does that give you? That gives you 46 chromosomes, right? So normally, you have a 46 chromosomes, right? So if you have a 23 chromosomes, right? We call them a haploid, right? But if you have 46 chromosomes, we call them a diploid, right? This is the thing. Now, but if you say, like, let's just say instead of doing, you do a 3n, and then you multiply by 3 times 23, what does that give you? That's a 69, right? Now, this is called triploid. You see, this is called triploid. I remember, if any number, if the number of chromosomes that comes after the multiplications of 23, like you have 23, you have 69, so 23 plus 23, what? 46, 46 plus 23, what? 69, 69 plus 23, 96, right? So if they are multiplied, right, like by 23 of chromosomes, right? Whatever the number you get, together, haploid, diploid, triploid, we call them all this, right? We call them a euploidy, right? This is what it's called, euploidy. So basically, whenever you hear like euploidy, think about this being normal, right? Like this means like euploidy means that because there are multiplications of a 23, right? That's what it means. 69 or like those 96, right? This chromosome, usually you can see that in cancer, but normal is 46. But if there's a multiplications of 23 is there, right? Whenever you multiply at 23, 46, 69, right? Then what happens is that we call them a euploidy, okay? Now, sometimes what happens is this, that instead of having a 46 chromosomes, right? Let's just say you can have a 2n and you have a -1 like this, right? So you have a 2n, 223 plus -1. What is this? You have 46, 46 minus 1 is what? 45, right? So if this is the case, right? Then what happens if there is a 1 chromosome is missing, right? If there is a 1 chromosome is missing, right? Or there is a 2n plus 1, let's just say 2 times 23 is 46 plus 1 over 47, right? That means there's 1 extra chromosome is there. Whenever there's either extra chromosomes or less chromosome is there, then we don't call them a euploidy. Instead, that we call them a aneuploidy. Right? This is what you have to be familiar with this definition.